All right, hey everybody, how are you? We are going to talk about energy flow today. So I thought, what a better way to talk about energy flow than to have my dog here, Annie. She's a 2-year-old mixed breed, and she is full of energy. So you just recently read on Actively Learn and took notes on energy flow on food chain. So I just want to make sure that you understand what you read. When we look at a food chain, we see that it is the pathway of food and energy through an ecosystem. When I look at this food chain that's on the screen here, I can see that the grasshopper is eaten by the frog, is eaten by the snake, is eaten by the hawk. And now my question is, there's something missing in this food chain. Do you know what it is? Well, if you said the producer, you're correct. Every food chain has to have a producer, okay? So like in this food chain, beautiful sounds. There are leaves that are eaten by the snail, which are eaten by the little bird, which then are eaten by the big bird, okay? Now notice the flow of energy. Those arrows actually mean something. So if we look at this diagram here, we have the grass is eaten by the rabbit. But which one is correct? Notice the arrows are going in different directions. Well, if you said number one, the top one, you are correct. Now, an easy way to remember that is to show Pac-Man. So let me show you Pac-Man. I'm going to draw on here. Let me pull my cap off. Okay? If I take this and I draw Pac-Man, there's Pac-Man. Okay? If I draw Pac-Man, the rabbit eats the grass. In bottom two, it's saying the grass, this way, is eating the rabbit. If the grass eats the rabbit, that's pretty scary. Okay, so the first one is correct. So you always want the flow of energy. It's going from the grass to the rabbit. Okay, those arrows are really important. So a little more complex is a model called a food web. And here we look at the complex network of feeding relationships made up of many interconnected food chains. So this one's a little crazy, but they didn't identify the specific producers at all. They just said plants, and that's okay. But you can see that there are herbivorous insects. Again, we just learned those terms, herbivore, predaceous insects, insectivorous insects, and birds, okay? So you can follow the flow of energy from the plants all the way up. Now, each of these are given a trophic level. A trophic level is simply the name producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. The producer is eaten by the primary consumer, primary being first. The primary consumer is eaten by the secondary consumer. The secondary consumer is eaten by the tertiary consumer, so on and so forth, all the way up to the top level consumer. Okay? So remember that plants are producers and heterotrophs, everything else, are consumers. Okay? So if we look at this food web, it's pretty intense. We have grass, okay, as our producer, right? But what can producers do that consumers cannot? What can this grass do that the consumers cannot? Well, if you said photosynthesis, you're correct. They can make their own food. They're an autotroph. How about a secondary consumer? A secondary consumer. Well, if you said the spider, I agree. The spider is a secondary consumer because we can go from the grass. Grasshopper would be primary. Spider is secondary. If you said the toad, grasshopper is primary, toad is secondary. If you said the hawk, that is true. Rabbit to hawk is secondary consumer. Okay? So, sorry, let me go back. So, each organism on this food web can have different trophic levels depending on what food chain it's part of. The next step that you're going to be doing is making a food web in your notes. That's the next step. Okay? Now, let's look at this soil food web. Underneath your feet in the soil, there are tons and tons of critters. So many that we haven't even identified half of them. Scientists haven't. So when we look at this food web, Okay, we have organic matter and the bacteria and the fungus. Okay, and then we have the organisms that eat that. The biggest questions I have about this food web is, where does all of the energy originally come from in this food web? If you said the sun, you're correct. Every food web has the sunlight in it. Remember, sunlight is the energy for all living things. And at the end, when these organisms die, what takes care of them? If you said the decomposers, you're correct. Every food web has a decomposer. It could be fungus, it could be bacteria, but those organisms ultimately decompose the dead things and put that energy back into the soil. The final thing I wanted to talk to you today about were the energy pyramids. Okay? It's a chart showing the flow of energy through an ecosystem. So, the plants, of course, are the base of the energy pyramid. So just like when you're building a house, you need a base first before you can put anything else on it. The same thing here. The plants are the main item when it comes to an ecosystem. Without the plants, we wouldn't have anything else. As we move up the pyramid, we notice that 10% of the energy is moved on to the next trophic level. So the herbivores get 10% of the plant's energy, so on and so forth. And that's because those organisms need that energy, that other 90%, to actually survive and grow. So when we look at this trophic level, there it is. When we look at this trophic level, we notice that sunlight's on the bottom, then the producers, then the consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary. So every ecosystem can only handle so many top-level consumers. You need more organisms underneath that. And I hope that makes sense to you as we wrap up our energy information. The next thing you're going to do after this is create a food web in your notes, and then you're going to take a practice quiz so you prepare for your quiz on Thursday.